Welcome to the Centre of Brexit Studies YouTube channel. Today we're joined by Centre Director, Professor Alex de Ruyter. So Alex, we're coming to the end of our second week now working from home and day 3 of lockdown. How are you coping with the changes so far?
Well, Beth, it's been quite a turnaround, hasn't it? We've gone from our immediate universe, as it were, being anywhere we could travel in the world, to our world literally now being our house and the immediate neighbourhood surroundings when we can go out once a day for exercise or going to the shop, as it were. And that's about it. And, I think for a lot of people, that's a very difficult adjustment. Obviously, you might well think the one profession that might cope with this sort of extended self-isolation would be academics, but even then, we're only human. We have a basic need to connect with others.
Yeah.
And that's very hard.
Yeah, so Chancellor Rishi Sunak is unveiling financial aid for self-employed later today. What do you think the self-employed and freelance workers need at this time?
Well, clearly the big problem now for the UK economy is the rapid rise in unemployment that we are seeing. Of course, YouGov estimate 2 million people so far have lost their jobs due to businesses having to let them go or businesses collapsing, as it were. So the Chancellor, of course, has announced wage subsidy measures to support the employed people in the workforce, which is, indeed very commendable to support companies to the tune of up to $2,500 in supporting 80% of their wage. But then that leaves the huge problem of the so-called self-employed. Roughly 1/5 of the UK workforce are self-employed in some fashion. These people are commonly referred to as those working in the gig economy. When you think of your Uber drivers, Deliveroo, etc., but also workers in sectors like construction, of whom the vast majority of workers are not employees, they're just contractors. So they're not going to have benefited from his wage support measures. So I'm trying to match support to the self-employed in a similar fashion to waged and salaried employees creates particular problems, of course, because if you're talking about measures to try and match, say, for argument's sake, 80% of their earnings, the problem, of course, is how do you calculate those earnings? And if someone is just lodging a tax self-assessment, then you're going back to April last year. So the government obviously concerned about trying to find the right mechanism to do this. The second problem then relates to issues around actual government capacity to deliver income support in a timely fashion. As we're seeing at the moment with the 500,000 or so people who've tried to apply for universal credit over the last 10 days or so, the system is failing. And I say failing because it hasn't got the capacity to cope with the deluge. And I think that raises an important issue in terms of the fact that the state, or the civil service, people who work for the government, the public sector, have been heavily cut back. It has to be said by this government. The 80,000 jobs or thereabouts were lost over the last 10 years. And of course, in response to Brexit, the government hurriedly tried to get more people back. As a result of that, if you take HMRC alone, they've lost about 16,000 jobs due to government cutbacks. The actual physical capacity to deliver these income support measures quickly has to be questioned. And of course, if you're self-employed, if you don't have recourse to some form of income and you're relying on savings, life is going to get very hard in the short term. And of course, our benefit system is very, very, very mean. We've had 10 years of the benefit system being run down so that in order to get universal credit, I think £6,000 or so savings, you don't qualify. And that comes as a rude shock to many people. A lot of people who thought they were never going to be benefit scroungers or stay for money have woken up to find that actually when they think they qualify for financial assistance, they've been told they're not eligible. So what do you do? What do you do?
So there's been a lot of controversy surrounding what are essential workers, many in construction still being expected to go into work. Do the government need to be clearer on these rules and regulations?
Well, it's very difficult to define just what a key worker is, isn't it? I mean, the government announced only the other day that they would allow off licences to continue trading because that was seen as providing an essential item to consume for society. I mean, alcohol, so what is essential? What is a key worker? Obviously a key worker is someone who has to keep performing their job in order to keep the economy and society running. So, that's clearly evident for health workers, police, emergency services, other jobs like perhaps logistics and distribution, retail, people working in supermarkets. And of course, then there's been a bit of a selective interpretation of that, I suppose. If we think of Mike Ashley and Sports Direct saying that they were an essential provider, so we're trying to stay open, for example. Just the notion of what a key worker is often very difficult to clarify, because it all boils down to is that service essential to function for society to keep going? So it's understandable that there's been some confusion over that, I think.
So we discussed gig economy workers on the podcast earlier this week. What hit is the virus having on gig economy and 0-hour contract workers so far?
Well, I mean, to come back to my earlier point about what do you do here, the very simple answer to that is if you are in the gig economy, by definition, you're not an employee. So you're not getting employee benefits like sick leave. It's a big one, because if you then feel ill, if you have, even perhaps, I'm not saying that people would do this willfully, but the sheer reality is if they're not working, they're not getting any money, and therefore, ultimately they're not eating. So, of course, the temptation will be for your cabbie drivers or your building workers or couriers or whatever. They have to keep working. And therefore, this is the entire reason now why we're talking about trying to announce income assistance measures for these people who are classed as self-employed. My answer to that, of course, is if you want to solve this problem medium to long term, or if you want to tackle it truly and comprehensively without having to put people through the rigmarole of applying for something, like with universal credit, the only answer to this for these people really is to embrace some form of basic income. We talk about a universal basic income, in which everybody gets a certain minimum amount of money. For argument's sake, you could say 10 grand per annum, irrespective of your labour market status. These are the kind of conversations that we really seriously need to be having now. Otherwise, this problem of one quarter of the workforce, being forced to continue doing the job because they have nothing to fall back on, sick pay or whatever, will continue to haunt us. And I think that's one thing this crisis really has shone a light on. A, that we have a quarter of the economy, a quarter of the workforce, in effect, having no social safety net as such in that fashion. And B, the fact that so many of us are now having to work from home has really shone a light again on the importance of care work. I personally am having to balance, doing my job with childcare, for example, with, kids being sent home from school. And so that really, to me, also shines a light on the importance of being a full-time carer. So, we really need to revisit that debate and consider a basic income supporting them as well.
And how do you think Boris Johnson has come across during this crisis so far? Do you think he's proving his critics wrong?
Well, I think it's always interesting to note, of course, that in the whole Brexit referendum campaign, he and his like-minded folks spent a lot of time disparaging the views of experts and that they were wrong and that it was all project fear. And now, of course, when we have a genuine crisis, isn't it amazing to see how experts in the form of the chief medical officer or the chief scientist have been rehabilitated? And it's quite noticeable that Johnson always appears on the podium flanked by these two individuals, Chris Whitty and Patrick Vallance. So in terms of his performance, well, for a man who climbed the greasy pole of politics, trying to play the buffoon, trying to play the joker, it's not a laughing matter anymore. And I mean, this really will test his capacity to grasp the details of the situation and indeed his leadership thereof.
Thank you for joining me, Alex. And for those watching, we wish you all the best.
You too.